is with me now here on the Sputnik. Patrick Cockburn, thanks for joining us. You wrote a wonderful piece this week about the somewhat peculiar relationship between Britain and Saudi Arabia, indeed Western countries and Saudi Arabia, who, as you demonstrate in the piece, are responsible for and paying for extremism, sometimes of a very virulent kind, throughout the world, throughout the Muslim world. What's your conclusion as to why we should be in this peculiar relationship with them?
Well, it is very strange, as you say, since it's in plain view that the way that militant, fundamentalist, Sunni fanaticism has grown up really over the last 30 years has been through the support of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies. Yet the US and Britain have gone out of their way to pretend that somehow Iran is behind it or Iraq is behind it, while their own reports, as revealed in the 9/11 Commission and by WikiLeaks, say private donors in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf are the people who support Al-Qaeda and extreme Sunni organizations.
Well, the world was fixated this week when President Obama just shook the hand of the Cuban leader, Raul Castro, which is a country 90 miles away from his coast. But Western leaders are forever kissing the nose of the Saudi ruling elite and selling them guns.
You know, you look at Syria today, you know, who funds the insurgents? They were supported by Qatar until midsummer. Now Saudi Arabia has taken over the file, speaks of raising a substantial Sunni army that somehow will be against Assad, but will also be against Al-Qaeda, but yet Al-Qaeda-linked organizations seem to be part of it. So there's no question about their central role in funding fundamentalist, jihadi organizations from the 1980s, from the time of the Taliban in Afghanistan, the insurgents in Syria, Iraq. You know, this record is obvious and pretty well undenied.
Well, as you put it in plain view, and it was ever thus, the fathers of the Taliban, the fathers of Al-Qaeda, indeed some of the founding members of Al-Qaeda, were initially paid for in Afghanistan by Saudi money, routed through Sadat's Egypt, on the orders of the American administration, with the British of Mrs. Thatcher close behind. But this seems to have survived the Al-Qaeda turn, which slaughtered thousands of Americans.
Yes, I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. I mean, there is still part of the 9/11 Commission report, I think, which is to deal with Saudi Arabia, which hasn't been published. But why has it happened? I think one reason is that all these Al-Qaeda-linked organizations are primarily killing other Muslims. They're killing Shia, and if they're not killing other Muslims, they're killing Christians, Iraqi Christians, Syrian Christians. Suppose for a moment that they were killing people in Western Europe or in America. I don't think there'd be quite the same tolerant attitude towards these private donors in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies who are allowed to operate so freely.
I can understand why cynical Western politicians are prepared to avert their gaze from 9/11 and 7/7 in England, when 55 people were slaughtered on the London transport system. The Madrid bombings, where an even larger number were slaughtered. But the role of the media, you would have thought, would be to point out the inconsistency, hypocrisy of being in bed with Al-Qaeda, the same Al-Qaeda that sowed such carnage in our own countries.
I still find it amazing, because it's one of those stories which is very dramatic, but you don't have to dig for. You don't have to know some highly informed diplomat or have some secret source. I mean, it's been more perhaps patent through documents, you know, released by WikiLeaks. There's a long memorandum from Hillary Clinton at the end of 2009 saying exactly the same thing as the 9/11 Commission had said 7 or 8 years earlier, that the people who support Al-Qaeda and the jihadi organizations are primarily donors in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And there's no change in this, and not much is done about it. So it seems to me one of the great stories of the world, but largely uncovered.
Indeed. And I suppose the most obvious explanation is that we do very good business with Saudi Arabia. There's the endless recycling of Saudi petrodollars through London and New York and so on. But could it be that there is more to it than just brass? Could it be that that Al-Qaeda is somehow a useful weapon in reserve for the big powers? I mean, they have been used in Syria in exactly that way.
It's all a bit like Afghanistan, I think, in a way, that there's a time when it's all okay to fund these very dangerous people, and then, surprise, surprise, you find that they don't like you very much, and they turn into some new form of Al-Qaeda.
Frankenstein, of course, thought he could build a monster and keep control of it, but the reason it's called a monster is because you can't keep control of it. But what's going to happen now? I think we agree that the war, though continuing to rage in Syria and blood continuing to flow, has turned decisively against Al-Qaeda and the fanatics. I think that Geneva 2 or 3 or 4 will ultimately bring about some kind of negotiated end to this conflict. But all these jihadis are dressed up with somewhere to go. Where might they go?
Well, some of them will come back and presumably won't have changed their views very much. They'll spread all over the place, like they did from Afghanistan. I think very late in the day, this has begun to worry Washington and London and Paris. But, you know, to my mind, surely it's too late, because you have hundreds and thousands of these people.
Well, that's a fact. The people in this country have been transfixed by the horror of what happened on a South London street a year or so ago, where an attempt was made to decapitate a young soldier in broad daylight in front of women and children by the very people that the British and other governments are supporting in Syria. If these fanatics had gone to Aleppo to commit such an atrocity, the British would have paid for the knife.
Well, yeah, they just, I'm not, you know, I don't think that they somehow, they don't associate supporting in general the rebels with the guys who are cutting throats in the streets of Aleppo. You know, last week they shot a guy, you know, who was he was selling diesel in Aleppo, and he described himself as the god of fuel, as an advertising slogan. They shot him for blasphemy immediately. You know, this is one of many stories. And so I think it's only now that the people are beginning in government to realize what a sort of Frankenstein, as you say, they've been allowing to develop in Syria and in northern Iraq. This is a great swathe of territory that is now under the control of Al-Qaeda. Despite everything, all these billions of dollars, these enormous security organizations established since 9/11, how come that Al-Qaeda, which used to be a very small organization, is now a very big organization and controls everything, or much of what happens between Mosul, a city in northern Iraq, and the Mediterranean? You know, this is an extraordinary development.
Especially as we were led to believe that upon the killing of bin Laden, that was more or less the end.
Yeah, that's what this was. But this is, you know, there's a phoniness about all this, of we're combating Al-Qaeda. Where do we go? Do we go to northern Iraq, where they're very strong, northern Syria? No, we go to the hill villages of Yemen, you know, Bedouin encampments there, and have drone strikes. Or, you know, in North Waziristan. This is not where the action is. I mean, it's kind of easy to do there, and you can publicize great victories, but it's not where the serious battles are being fought. and it's not where the serious battles are being lost.
Patrick Cockburn, thanks very much indeed for joining us on the Sputnik.
Thank you so much.
Well, this is the part of the show